We're talking today with Ron Konyndyk of Muskegon, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Okay, so Ron, start with some background on yourself, and to begin with, where and when were you born?
Well, I was born in Grand Rapids, Michigan, into a very good home, with a very stable home, with a father that went to work every day and a mother that stayed home and took care of us kids every day, and ended up going through high school and then going on to college after that. Probably the biggest reason for going to college was to avoid the draft.
Okay, let's back up a little bit and
Okay.
fill in a couple of things. So, what year were you born?
In 1944,
All right, and where was your father when you were born?
he was in the Army. He had been drafted a little later on. I even had an older brother too, so they were taking just about everybody at that time.
Right, and you don't know a whole lot about your father's service career.
Well, we're digging now, and we're starting to find out some things. I have a brother and a sister that are very diligent in working to find out more.
Okay.
So
All right, and then what was your father doing for a living when you were growing up?
he worked as an executive in a furniture company.
Okay, and when did you finish high school?
Finished high school in 1962, June of 62.
Okay, and where did you go to college?
I went to Ferris State College in Big Rapids, Michigan. Took a few courses once in a while at Davenport College because they would transfer back and forth. And it was a little cheaper to do it that way because then I could live at home too. And
All right,
just divided up the college time a little bit that way. But the last 2 years, 3 years, something like that, was all at Ferris State University.
okay, and what did you take a degree in?
It was business.
All right, now did you work while you were in school?
Yes, worked very hard because I paid my entire tuition bill myself. I guess my folks weren't happy with the way I didn't apply myself in high school like I probably should have, and weren't real willing to support me in my college endeavors. So I had a job, a lot of different jobs, but the primary one was I was working a night shift at Keywer Brass Company 2 nights a week, and one of the nights was Friday night. And so I did it that way. Paid very good, so I was able to pay for my own car and my own tuition and my own room and board.
Okay, all right, and when did you graduate?
I graduated in May of 1967.
All right, now had you already had a draft physical or something like that early on, or
They were constantly hounding me because there was one term where I didn't take any classes, and because of that, they really started getting on my case. I just worked. I had a fella in our church that was in the real estate business and knew I took a bunch of real estate courses, and he said, "Come to work for me for a while," but which I did, and enjoyed that very much, and probably should have gone back to that after my Vietnam experience, but I didn't. But I enjoyed that, and just had to go back to college because the draft people were all over me at that time. It was amazing the way they kept track of you.
okay, so basically, did you have to demonstrate to them that you were in fact returning to school the next
Yes.
term?
Oh yes, they had to see copies of everything.
All right.
So-
So you knew you were already basically on their list, and once you
Yeah.
graduated, you were going to get drafted.
And that's why I was in no hurry to finish, because I kept thinking that the Vietnam War was going to start to wind down and they weren't going to need as many people. But unfortunately, it kept ramping up the whole time to the point where in 1967, when I graduated, boy, they were after everybody they could get.
All right. And when did you get the draft notice?
Well, I got the draft notice probably the week after I graduated. But what I was trying to do and stall things was I was trying to enlist in the Air Force, but I only wanted to do that if I could get in a specific area in officers training school. And I even had Jerry Ford, who was my representative at that time, try to help me out, but he couldn't even get me in officers training school because everybody that was graduating from college was doing that.
Right.
And so then I thought, well, my only hope is just they'll find a good job for me and I'll be out in 2 years instead of 4 years.
Right, because if you're drafted in the
It's
Army
four.
anyway, it's a 2-year.
2 year, yeah.
Okay, so so you are able to delay induction for a while by doing
right.
this. So when do you actually have to report for training?
I reported for training, I think it was on December 7 of 1967.
Okay. Now, at this point, what did you know about Vietnam?
I knew it was kind of a nasty war and it was escalating, and it was kind of a little bit before all the protests were coming in and all that kind of stuff. But right after I got in, that just started to explode.
All right. Now, what's the sequence for processing you? Where do you report initially, and where do they send you?
Well, I got on a bus right at the draft board in downtown Grand Rapids, and they took us on a bus down to Detroit. I think that was Fort Jefferson or something like that.
Or Fort Wayne, maybe?
Or Fort Wayne, something like that. I think it was on Jefferson Street,
Yeah.
I think, okay. Because then you had to go through all your physical stuff for, it was pretty much of a whole day.
Okay.
And I always tell the story that I was on the bus with a fellow that I knew a little bit, and he was determined when he got off the bus in Detroit, he was headed for the border because that was another way to avoid it. And never saw him again. To this day, I've never seen him. But he was not on the plane that night headed to Fort Knox.
All right. Did you consider going to Canada, or were you just going to do your thing?
You know, I had pretty much made up my mind ahead of time that I had to do what I had to do.
Right.
And I'm sure my family would have been disappointed, and there was no end at that time to going to Canada. You didn't know when you could ever come back.
Right. Okay. Now, when you do the physical there at Detroit, how serious a physical was it?
It was not all. I was disappointed because they were giving me a test for color blindness, and they flipped through all the things, and you had to read the number on every page, and I couldn't see a lot of them because I do have color blindness. And the guy slammed the book shut. He says, "We're going through this again." And we get done, and he says, "Anybody ever tell you were colorblind?" I says, "Yeah, I couldn't tell a brown uniform from a green one or a black one." And he says, "You still pass."
Yep.
So
When Uncle Sam needs you, they need you.
So it was off to Fort Knox.
Did you notice anybody trying to scam the system in one way or another, or do anything that would get them kicked out?
No, not
Okay.
really.
All right. Some people do, some don't, so I asked.
Well, if you were doing that, you had to do it way ahead of the physical.
Okay. All right. So now you spend a day, and then they load you on
A charter plane
okay.
to Fort Knox.
All right. That's down in Kentucky.
Yep.
So, and then what kind of reception do you get at Fort Knox?
Well, your world is completely changed. You're got to do everything a E2 corporal tells you have to do, or you're in trouble. And you learn discipline that way. So, and they really enforced a lot of things because what they needed was discipline. So, and then you have to go through the thing of getting all kinds of shots and getting issued all your equipment and your clothes and that kind of stuff, and assembled into different companies and barracks. And
Yeah. Were you one of the older guys there?
yes, yeah.
Were there some other guys like you who had been to college and got drafted after?
When we were in the big room with all of us, there were 180 of us. And they asked how many graduated from high school. Only about half the hands went up. And then they asked how many graduated from 4 years of college, and there were 4 of us. That really told me right there.
Okay. Now, then, what does the training itself consist of?
We had to go through all kinds of different things. Every day was something. One day that really stood out was when we had to go into tear gas and take off our mask and tell them what our name and what our Army number was and all of that, and then put the gas mask back on and clear it before we could leave out of there. And that was not a pleasant experience. But one of the other, we had to march out to the rifle range a lot and do a lot of different training and learn how to set all the settings on your rifle.
And what kind of rifle were you training with?
We were actually training with, it was not the M16. I think it was M14 or something like that. So they didn't have enough M16s. And it really wasn't until much later, before I was going to Vietnam, that I had to go spend a day with an M16.
Sorry. Yeah, because the M14 was a very different weapon. It was kind of an improved version of the old World War I M1
compared to the M16.
Yeah. Okay. And now, what kind of physical shape were you in when you went in?
Not too bad. I think I weighed about 190 pounds. By the time I got out of Vietnam, I was down to about 170. But by the time I was home for about 3 months, I was back up to 190 in a hurry.
All right. And how easy or hard was it for you to adjust to the Army way of doing things?
Actually, it was easier than what I thought it was going to be, because our drill sergeants were all from Alabama. And being at Fort Knox in January and February that year, they had a ton of snow. And these guys didn't want to go out and get their shiny boots and their pressed pants all messed up. So we got out of doing a lot of stuff other people had to do if they were there in better weather months.
All right. And then what about the discipline part? Did you figure out what they were doing? Or?
Oh, yes. I could just see that immediately. And I really looked at that as being a good thing, because I think a lot of these guys ended up needing some real discipline training. It didn't bother me. I could handle that. I had to be disciplined anyhow. I mean, going through college, paying your own way, you had to get up for class. I had to come up with enough money to pay the bills, all that kind of stuff.
So you just did what they told you to do.
Right.
Okay, and can get through it. So how long was basic?
It was about 8 weeks.
Okay. And now, at that point, what happens to you?
Well, after basic, then you get orders as to where you're going to go for your next level of training. And of course, at that time, most of the guys were going on to advanced infantry training at Fort Polk, Louisiana. And I was kind of fortunate, because they had done a lot of testing on us before we really started on basic training. And one of the things in one of the tests, at the very end of the test, the last item was diagramming a cathode ray tube. And I had just gotten, my last course at Ferris was a physical science class, where we learned all about a cathode ray tube. So I could just draw that thing out. And early on in basic training, a captain came over one night and asked to see me in the barracks. And of course, you're scared when that happens, because you think, what happened? Did one of your parents die? Or, you know, are you being accused of something you didn't do, or what's going on? And he took me over to the day room, and he put some money in a pop machine and bought me a Coke and had a bunch of papers there. And he says, yeah, he says, I'm in charge of the testing. And we have never had anybody completely diagram that cathode ray tube that I can remember. But he says, you did. And he says, I got an offer for you you can't refuse. He said, I can send you at this point for, I don't know what it was almost 8 months of training at Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, which was kind of known as a country club among Army bases, for electronics school. But here you have to sign for another year. And I had to look at him and say, nope, I'm not signing. He says, well, then you'll probably go on with the rest of these guys to Fort Polk, Louisiana, and that was the end of it. And so I went through the rest of basic training, and shortly, or at the day we're all getting our orders, I open up mine, and it's for Fort Monmouth, New Jersey, for the radio school, and I didn't have to sign up for the other year.
How about that?
And that was nice, because it was like going to college.
Okay. So what was it like?
It was going to classes, and we were being tested every week for what we knew, and some of the tests were, they would have radio stuff in front of us that we had to troubleshoot. It was always kind of funny, because some of these guys were putting their little tester in, and they were just getting a shock and getting blown right off their stool. You know, we were kind of distracting when we were having these tests. You know, you're trying to troubleshoot, and here the guy next to you has got blown off his stool by a shock. But and if anybody dropped or didn't pass, they would have to go take that previous week over again. And I don't know how many times you got to do that before they booted you, but I went through right on schedule. But what they told us right up front was half of the class was going to go to Aviano, Italy, and the other half was going to the 52nd Signal Corps Battalion in Vietnam. So I knew I was in the Aviano, Italy part of it. And the last week, one of the guys that was going into the Vietnam part didn't pass. And my name, being K, was right in the middle, and I got transferred into the Vietnam side. So all the time I was going to class there, I thought, man, I'm going to Aviano, Italy. I'm going to enjoy this Army thing. So it was a little devastating to get that change at the last minute.
All right. Now, did they treat you differently at Monmouth than they had at Fort Knox?
Oh, totally. Totally. They just left you alone. Come Saturday, Sunday, if you wanted to sleep in the barracks, you could sleep in the barracks. If you wanted to go into New York, which was close by, you could go into New York. You could go out surfing. You could check out even a surfboard and go surfing at Long Branch, New Jersey, if you wanted to. It was that nice.
Okay. And how long was that school?
Well, it was from February until August.
Okay. So it wasn't quite as long as the school that they were going to send you to with the extension, because I think they said 8 months.
Well,
or do you think
it was
it's
8 months? It was maybe 6 months.
okay?
Something
So
like
you got
that.
the same course, basically.
I got the same course.
Okay. Now, what were they actually preparing you to do?
Well, they wanted me to operate in a microwave radio, which was kind of a line of sight, good for maybe 40 or 60 miles, depending on the terrain. But when I got over to Vietnam, they unloaded a whole bunch more on me. And we had tropospheric scatter communications, and, we were relaying stuff between our, for the 9th Infantry Division, when they would send guys out to a little fire base somewhere, they had to have some communications, and that's what we had to wire in so that they could be talking to whoever they needed to talk to for airstrikes or ammunition or more food or whatever.
All right. Okay. So you have this nice extended period of training, and then you get to the end of it, you find out at the end, okay, you're going to Vietnam.
Right.
Now, what did they do to prepare you to go to Vietnam?
They sent me out to Fort Dix for a Saturday of learning the M16,
Mm-hmm.
which I did well in because I ended up getting my expert badge. And I was not a big guy for guns. I didn't hunt or didn't collect guns and anything like that.
Okay. But they weren't teaching you anything about Vietnam as a place or anything else like that?
You were constantly hearing about it, why you were doing this and why
Okay.
you were doing that.
All right, so it's sort of part of, it's integrated in your training in that sense.
Yeah.
But that was just while you were doing the rest of your training?
Training, yeah.
Okay. All right. Now, do they give you a leave home before they ship you to Vietnam?
They did. Yeah. I went home for a week or two or something like that.
Okay. And now what's the process for getting you to Vietnam?
Well, I had to fly to Oakland, California, where they loaded you on a plane, and it was kind of a three-legged flight to Tokyo or to Yokota Air Base or something like
Mm-hmm.
that, and then to Okinawa, and then to Vietnam.
All right.
So
And where do you land in Vietnam?
we landed north of Saigon in Long Ben.
Mm-hmm.
Was the name of the place.
Okay. And what's your first impression of Vietnam when you get there?
The smell. It was not like anything I had experienced. So, but yeah, it wasn't where you were immediately cast into battle.
Mm-hmm.
I had to go through a few things. They even sent me out to a communications base in Vung Tau, which was right on the South China Sea,
Mm-hmm.
to become a little bit familiar with the equipment that I was going to be using. And then I got sent to a place called Dong Tam, where they were moving the 9th Infantry Division from Bearcat into Dong Tam. And so they were still building barracks, they were still clearing land. I went the first 3 months there without having a shower to stand under. I had to stand under the tin roof when it rained and try to scrub myself, or I had to go down to the Mekong River, which was right there, which was a dirty brown river, and try to bathe in there. But shortly thereafter, and it could have been almost 3 months before they put a tank up in the air painted black that they would come and fill up with water, and you had this little chain you had to pull when you wanted some water on you.
All right. So you land at Long Binh. How long do you stay at Long Binh?
Maybe a week at most.
Okay. And what do you do during that time?
You're just going to different orientations and things like that.
Okay. And now are they trying to explain Vietnam to you, or?
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
And is anything about that training that stands out for you?
Well, they really didn't tell me about the basics, the fact that how all these communist countries were trying to expand their territory,
Mm-hmm.
and why North Vietnam wanted South Vietnam. And they didn't explain to me what the problem was in South Vietnam, which was corruption in the government.
Yeah.
That was never explained. I had to figure that out on my own by what I was reading in the news and things like that.
Okay. But they teach you anything about the local culture or customs or do's and don'ts?
Not much, because you did not get into those kind of areas.
Okay.
You were separated from it. You really didn't want to, because you didn't know who was Viet Cong and who was a good Vietnamese citizen.
Okay. And then how did they get you out to Vung Tau?
By helicopter.
Okay. Now, had you been ridden in helicopters before, or was that new?
That was the first of many.
Mm-hmm.
Had a lot of helicopter rides. That was the workhorse there.
Okay. And then what was the facility at Vung Tau like?
It was on top of a pretty high hill, and it was an old French outpost.
Mm-hmm.
And the bunkers were still there on the side of the hill. As you rode up to the top, you could see where the old cement bunkers were from the French.
Mm-hmm. And was that area fairly quiet while you were there?
That was the quietest area you could ever be in.
All right.
Because it was at the end of a long peninsula, so it could be controlled.
Okay. And how long did you stay there?
I think maybe a month, something like that.
And now, what equipment were they training you on for that?
They had, that was where they had the tropospheric scatter set up.
And explain what that is.
That is where they take signals and they bounce them off the ionosphere to get a bigger distance. And there was not a direct cable between Washington, D.C. and Vietnam. And they were always needing secure communications that could not be interrupted and that sort of thing. And that was just a new way to go a very long distance, whereas the microwave was very limited. So.
Okay. And so you're learning that, and then was there, and what facilities did you have there? What kind of barracks did you have, or?
It was just the regular barracks that we had built the same way in Dong Tam as what there were already in Vung Tau. But Vung Tau was the main center for bouncing everything back to the U.S. And what we ended up doing in Dong Tam really was just connecting into their stuff. We did not have as many tropospheric scatter things in Dong Tam.
So your job was just reporting kind of from the division back to Vung Tau, and then Vung Tau would send stuff.
Well, we did have some direct circuits, you know, going back to Washington.
Okay. All right. So and then on the base at Vung Tau, did they have Vietnamese working there, or were they all Americans?
Don't really remember Vietnamese there.
Okay. All right. Now you're sent down to Dong Tam, and describe that area.
Well, it was along the Mekong River, probably, I was saying about 5 miles, that's my estimation, west of a town called Mito, which was a fairly significant town. I got through it several times during my stay there. So we had a little outpost down in Ben Tre that I had to go down there several times, you know, by Jeep or by truck. And we did have a little outpost too of communications at Mito. It was in an old, I heard it was a seminary building. But where I was in Dong Tam, there was nothing there. The Marine River Force came in there and dug a little harbor for all of their boats. And then beyond that, they cleared a whole area for the 9th Infantry Division. And the 9th Infantry Division had a lot of helicopters too, so it was the base for a lot of helicopters. I would say, you know, 100 or 150 of them. And they all had them parked between bunker walls, so that if mortar rounds came in, they were halfway protected. And that was what was the problem at Dong Tam, was mortar rounds coming in all the time. And I kept a diary while I was there, and there were 183 mortar attacks during my time there.
And that's in
Dong Tam.
Yeah. And then how many months were you actually there? Were you there a full year?
I was there, I was in Vietnam a whole year, but probably a good 10 or 9 or 10 months in Dong Tam.
Okay, so that's a pretty regular mortaring then.
Yes, that was, you know, and when I say that, I mean, we might get a mortar attack in the morning and we might get one at night, you know, so that counted as two, even though they were on the same day. But generally, we had to really take cover when you heard the first round come in, because the Viet Cong were burying tubes to send those things, and they didn't know if they were going to hit our base or not. They just put them at an angle where they kind of figured it might hit. And but if the first one hit in the base, we always set off this siren, which told them, hey, that's a good tube.
Yeah.
So here would come another one. But by the time they had the third one on the way, we had something else on the way back to them to wipe out their mortar tube. So then they have to start all over.
Okay. And so typically, one of these attacks, how many rounds would they fire?
Generally 3.
Okay. Yeah. So this is not heavy
Well,
bombardment here.
No, well, and there were some nights where you would have that happen maybe 4 or 5 times during the night.
Did you ever get hit by rockets or anything
Well,
bigger?
these were kind of like rockets, really. I mean, when they exploded, that shrapnel just went out everywhere. And we had to come right through the walls of the barracks. Well, I wasn't there about 2 weeks, and I figured out I wanted to be on the first level of the barracks because that's where the sandbags were around. Because the guy sleeping in the bunk above me one night had his arm hanging out just above my head, and a piece of shrapnel came through right through his hand and wiped out all those bones in his hand.
Oh.
Just boom. First round, it hit right outside of our barracks, and I told me move downstairs in a hurry.
Okay. Now, let's see. You were part of a signal battalion, and you're attached to the 9th Division.
Yes.
How many men from your battalion were there?
I think probably only about 15.
Okay. And was that the group that you hung out with, or
Yeah.
did you associate much with any of the other guys from 9th Division?
No, never. We talked to them on the radio, but that was about it.
Well, would you? I mean,
We would
eat with them, or
yeah, we would eat with them, but we never got to know them
Okay.
because, we were always with our own people. And a lot of times where we were, we didn't get a lunch break. We'd have our tin tray with our food brought into us.
okay. And so, what do you remember about the guys who were in your unit? Are there any particular ones that stand out for you, or?
Well, there were 3 that I went through my training in Fort Monmouth with. That 2 of them, 3 of them, that were with me over there.
And did you get along with each other?
We did, got along very well. In fact, one of them, even after I got home, I was out in California, and I even stopped in to see him. But the other one that was real close to, I looked him up on the internet. He still lives in Arizona, where he was from, but I haven't made any effort to contact him.
Okay. So, did you have a daily routine there?
Well, our routine was we were on 12 hours and we were off 12 hours, 7 days a week. So if we were writing letters or doing little tape recordings or whatever, we had to do it in the 12 hours that we were not on. And we kind of alternated back and forth. We'd work days for a while, and then we'd work nights. And it was like from 7 a.m. to 7 at night, or you started at 7 at night and worked till 7 in the morning.
Okay. And sort of how much activity do you have on a shift? Were you constantly sending or
Yeah, there
resending
were
messages?
all kinds of new things that had to be wired in to our communications van, and things circuits that were not working that we had to troubleshoot, find out what was wrong, that sort of thing. And we had to do enemy activity reports. We had small equipment repairs, and sometimes we would even have to take a piece of equipment back to Vung Tau, because that's where the repair shop was, and get it repaired. And then we got to stay there a day or 2 while they repaired it, and they had the nice beach there where we could hang out. So that was, we kind of fought for that, to be able to take a piece of equipment back.
All right. Now, did you have a sense of, given what you were doing, of sort of how the war was going, or at least how the war in your area was going?
Well, every report we got was that we were just knocking them dead. We were stacking up Viet Cong body bags, and, but we were losing people too. But, how we had to rely too much on information from the news media back in the States. And I know from the enemy activity reports that we sent in that they were not being reported accurately. And I can remember one that we typed up where during the night we got hit by, I think it was 4 bazooka rounds. Hardly made note of it, you know, but so we sent that in that way, that during the night at various times we got hit by 4 rounds of bazooka, but no damage, no casualties. And then my parents sent me the clipping back from the newspaper, and it says that Dongtam weathered an all-night bazooka barrage.
Wow.
So, you know, the news people were starting on that then already, and really started turning the country against the war.
Well, it's a piece of a rather bigger puzzle, but yeah, after the Tet Offensive, coverage
Ramped up.
ramped up a lot,
Yeah.
and that's something I've heard from a lot of different people who were there, even somebody who was at Dong Tam, talking about talking to journalists and stuff, and finding out what they were doing and what would be the editors wanted and didn't want, and everything else. So that's all going on. But from as far as you could tell, the 9th Division was kind of being successful at what it was trying to do.
Yeah. Well, they had kind of not concentrated on that area much. And as a result, the Viet Cong kind of infiltrated it. And then the Marine or the Navy's Riverine Force came in there to that river because they were coming down through Cambodia and taking all their supplies into the Viet Cong down that river. And I remember flying over in a helicopter, and I mean, it's just pothole after pothole after pothole where the sides of that river had been bombed. So.
All right. Okay. Now, at Dong Tam, do you have Vietnamese working on the base there?
We did.
Okay.
We did. But what they generally were the wives and kids of Vietnamese who were serving in the Army of the Republic of Vietnam. That's who they trusted to do that, and we had absolutely no problem with them.
Okay. And what kinds of jobs do they do?
They, in some cases, washed our clothes, shined our boots, changed our bedding. Yeah, we had it pretty good, really.
Well, so did you, where you were quartered, were all 15 of you basically in the same building?
Yes,
Okay.
same barracks.
And then did you have any of these women working for you as hooch maids, or did you have somebody who washed your clothes or things like that?
Yeah, it was pretty regular. We had an older woman and her daughter that serviced our area. So.
Okay. And
paid them just about nothing. You know.
But in Vietnam, it was something.
It was something, yeah.
All right. Now, what was it like to go out to some of these smaller bases? What do you remember about that?
Yeah, it was, it was scary because you were out in the open. And we had at one time where somebody did take some shots at us from a tree, but in the back of the truck were a bunch of guys with their M16s, and the next thing you know, his body's falling out of the tree.
So that's when you were en route from one place to another.
Yeah, it was going.
And did you have to worry about mines or IEDs?
Yeah, because we had several guys that were in our barracks. They were not in our unit, but they had rode over them and lost arms and whatnot. Even got killed. Some of them even got killed. And we had one group, from Mito, that was trying to bring some equipment. I think it was over to us. And they did it at night, and they should have never been out at night. And they got shot right out of their Jeep. They owned the night. The Viet Cong owned the night.
Okay. Now, did the pattern of enemy activity change much over the course of the year you were there?
No.
Okay, so it's still pretty much the same.
Yep. Yeah. It just didn't seem like there was great progress.
Yeah. Were there ever incidents where sappers tried to get into the wire or get into the base?
There was one time, that was during a Tet, offensive, where they tried to come over the barrier along our little airstrip. And our airstrip was all these sections of metal that were all pieced together.
Right.
And I can still remember seeing a Cobra helicopter come down along that berm that was right along the runway there. And as he was shooting down, it was like somebody was throwing a bunch of shiny tin can covers up in the air because they were bouncing off that metalwork. But that pretty much got stemmed. They did get to an oil tank and, set that off. But that was really about the extent of it.
Okay. And that was Tet 69?
Yes.
Yeah. Because normally when we say Tet offensive, we think 68, but the fact was that there was also
one in 69 too, but it was much, much weaker than the one in 68.
Right. So for the most part, you could kind of go about your business on the base, except for dodging the mortars. Now, when the mortar attacks came, would you go into a bunker or just?
We had a big, heavy-duty bunker, and there was one instance where I forget where I was, but I wanted to get back to the bunker. I knew rounds were coming in, so I was out in the open with another guy, and we were running to get to the bunker. He got to the doorway of the bunker, and I was, 3-4 feet behind him, so I was not to the doorway yet. And one of the rounds hit our ammunition dump. And when that thing went up, that was a concussion explosion. I just will never forget. Hope never experience anything like that. It curled up the tin on our corrugated tin on our roofs. It blew the screens out of the windows. And the fellow that was ahead of me got pushed into the bunker by the force of the concussion. I got knocked off my feet. I was laying on the ground. But he felt all kinds of stones and stuff hit him in the back, which he thought a mortar round had landed right behind him and blew him in, and that his back was full of holes. And I kind of crawled into the bunker, and he saw me crawl in. He thought I was gone, and I was fine. And we took about 5 minutes to convince him he had no holes in his back, that he was good. It was just stones that hit him. So, but.
All right. And did you get it? So you went occasionally. So when you went into other places, what would you, if you went to Ben Head or you went to Mito or something like that, what were you doing?
Generally equipment, exchanges, that sort of thing. A couple times I went with our commanding officer with the payroll. That was probably the most. And a lot of times I wouldn't mind doing it, because if I went down to Ben Tray, the nice thing about being at Ben Tray overnight was they had flush toilets. Something we didn't have.
All right.
That was a treat.
Okay. Now, did you do anything in the villages or towns outside of the bases, or did you just kind of stick to bases?
No, just didn't trust everything.
Okay. Now, was there some kind of village or settlement outside of Dong Tam? Did the Vietnamese congregate there at all?
No. It was out kind of in the middle of nowhere.
So the people who worked on the base, did they come in from Mito, or?
They came in from Mito. They all had their motor scooters with 5-10 people piled on a motor scooter. It was hilarious to see how many people they could fit on a motor scooter. The only thing we did once in a while is we would have to leave the base to go to the garbage dump. Because when these mortar rounds would come in, there would be a bunch of tin that was chewed up and screens that got stuff and a bunch of wood with holes in it, and it would all get loaded on a truck, and we'd take it to the dump. And that was always interesting, because the stuff never made it to the dump. When you were turning down the road to go into the dump, the grandmothers were all sitting along the side of the road, and they had all these little grandchildren that would come running for the truck, and they would want to be on that truck while it was still moving and start sorting through what was on it and throw it off. And then somebody down on the ground would take it and drag it back to Grandma, and she would guard it. So by the time we got to the actual dump, there wasn't much to unload. Sometimes there wasn't even anything. You just turn around and come home. And I actually saw houses built out of wood that when our mortar rounds came in these wooden boxes.
Mm-hmm.
And homes were built out of the lumber from those wooden boxes.
Yeah. All right. Now, did you get any R&R time while you were in Vietnam?
I did. In fact, I managed 2 of them.
Okay.
And the way I did that is I took the first one to Singapore because I thought, boy, Singapore is someplace that's going to be very hard to get to later in life.
Mm-hmm.
So I went there and spent a week there. That was wonderful. It just blew me away what a modern city that was.
Mm-hmm.
It was more modern than anything I'd seen in the United States. And then shortly before I was leaving, it was really at the beginning of August, I found out that all the R&R slots we had for our company weren't being used because some of the guys, you had to show you had a certain amount of money
Mm-hmm.
before you could go. And these guys, they couldn't save any money or they were sending it all home to their wife or whatever. But there was a slot open at the beginning of August. I thought, I got the money, I'm going to take it.
Mm-hmm.
So I took an R&R to Australia,
Okay.
which was their winter,
Mm-hmm.
but I was a skier, so I got on a plane in Sydney and I flew on to a town called Cooma in the mountains and went skiing at Threadbow.
Wow.
And that was a real treat. Have my nose dripping because it's cold after having been in Vietnam. So,
All right.
but I wasn't sending money home to my parents or a wife or anything like that. So
And you weren't squandering it and gambling or...
there really wasn't much chance to do that because you could go to the PX, you could buy beer for 10 cents a can, a pack of cigarettes was 20 cents, not that I smoked, but I did buy some stereo equipment through the PX in Japan and had it sent to my brother, but that was about all I could spend money on. And I was getting hazardous duty pay, and I was E5 and all that. So
Okay. And I guess without a town there weren't as many opportunities for people to squander their money on
No.
things they shouldn't be doing.
No, but a lot of guys were, they were buying a bunch of junk out of the PX, junk food. And so we did have a PX on our base.
Right.
You could get a lot of stuff from.
Okay. Now, there are a variety of stereotypes about what went on in Vietnam, and so I'll kind of ask about them as to see what your take was. One of them has to do with the use of drugs. I mean, were there people on the base who were using different things, or
Yeah.
what did you observe?
Yeah, there were a few. And marijuana was the thing of choice. But I, to this day, have never touched marijuana, never wanted to. Because I guess going over there, my whole thing was I wanted to come home. I wanted to make it home. And if you're drunk or you don't have all your facilities about you and something happens, I want to have my wits about me at all times. And I saw this happen one night. That one guy, he had way too much beer or marijuana or something, but we were watching a movie on the side of a building. They painted one of the sides of a building white, and we would get movies every so often, and they would show a movie. And during the movie, here a mortar round comes in not too far away. And once you knew one was coming in, there's going to be the 2 more following, and they're going to be right in that same area. And so this one was close. And on the way to the bunker, which wasn't that far away, he tripped because he didn't see one of the things that we were sitting on. We had a bunch of big timbers that we were sitting on, and he didn't see it, and he tripped right over it, and he caught a lot of shrapnel. He survived it, but we never saw him again, but he ended up going to Japan for treatment.
Okay.
And that just enforces it in your mind that you want to take a drug like that and risk not having all your facilities about you when it comes time when you need them. So.
Okay. Another thing that comes up is the question of race and racial tensions. I mean, was your little unit all white, or did you have a mix of guys?
We had a mix, and I was, the Army was really one of the places where I really got thrown in the mix, because when I was in School of Commerce there at Ferris, there weren't many people of color, or even different ethnicities there. I mean, it was just mainly white guys.
Yes.
And but got along beautifully. We had no problems, no issues. And if they were in the Signal Battalion, they knew how to live, they knew how to act.
Right.
There weren't those kind of problems.
Right. Yeah. Okay. And I mean, that's typical of units like that in Vietnam, as far as I can tell.
Yeah. I don't know what it was like in an infantry unit. But
okay. Now, to think back over the time that you spent in Vietnam, are there other particular incidents that kind of stand out in your memory, or things that you think of when you think of being there?
There were a lot of hazardous, what I would say close calls, but you don't get them out of your mind. I mean, they stick with you. And some things you never found out what happened. For instance, one time I was taking a piece of equipment into Vung Tau to have it repaired. And I was in a string of helicopters. There were probably 3 of them. And I was in the last one. And the first one, all of a sudden, boom, big old cloud of smoke. And then we went around and came back toward where that smoke was coming from. And they dropped down to a level that was right at treetop. And the old helicopter was just moving it like this. So it couldn't get shot at. It was like the helicopter was hanging on the end of a rope and just going all over the place. And one of the pilots said to me, "Unhook your seatbelt and lay on the floor, because we're going to be landing." And just as we landed, I could see a helicopter coming from the other way that put a smoke screen across the opening, and then we were right up against some trees. And we weren't on that ground but 4 or 5 seconds. And here these 2 guys come running out of the trees with their helmets on, with their cords hanging in it. They jump in the helicopter and they plug in, and they're talking with the 2 pilots. In the meantime, the helicopter's all of a sudden taking off. They didn't tell me to get back in and fasten my seatbelt. All of a sudden, I'm laying on the floor holding on to the supports of the seat, keep from sliding out because they took off on a real slant. And when I got to Vung Tau, the helicopter never landed. They hovered at about 3 feet off the ground and had me jump off with a piece of equipment. I never found out what happened. Did they get shot down? Did something blow up in the airplane, or what happened? I have a feeling they got shot down, but I don't know.
Yeah. All right. Other instances that kind of stand out for you?
Yeah, it was just the damage that was done by that ammo dump blowing up. It was all over the base. It was just tremendous. I never knew where the ammo dump was. I never knew what was in it. Nothing like that. But
was it just a single explosion?
Single explosion. Just absolutely rocked everything.
All right. Now, as you got close to the time for your year in Vietnam to end, were you counting down the days or keeping track of that?
Everybody had a calendar with it marked down. And I had a decision in June that I don't know who it was it Nixon, was going to be removing some people and wanted the Army Republic of Vietnam to take over some of the areas. and our base was one of them. And so at the beginning of June, they said, you can go out of here early and go back to, it was Hawaii, to the Schofield Barracks, and serve out the rest of your year over there. Or you can stay till the end of August and get out and go home. So I thought, well, you know, if they're doing this, chances are I can survive it here, and then I'm out 4 months or 3 months early. And that really worried me after I made that decision. I was committed, and the Army of Republic of Vietnam was coming in, and they just didn't have it. You know, I was worried for my safety.
So they were now coming onto the base and providing base security and
Right.
that kind of thing?
Right.
What did you see of them, or what impression did they make on you?
Well, one thing we noticed is one morning, you know, outside of our barracks, we had a nice drinking fountain. It's gone. So, you know, we were worried about our stuff being stolen. And one thing that I had there was when somebody was rotating out of the country, they'd had one of these small refrigerators, and they had just come out with them. They were the neatest little things. And the guy was getting out at the end of the month when nobody had any money. So the price that he was getting for that refrigerator was going down, down, down. Finally, I got it for $25. But I had that thing there, and I would sell beers in the bunker after a mortar attack really calmed down, and we would have to wait for the all clear, and sometimes we'd have to wait a half an hour, even though we knew everything had calmed down. Well, I could sneak in and get a couple of beers, and I could sell them for a couple bucks a piece in the bunker, and so I more than got my money out of it, but I was afraid that thing was going to be gone.
All right. A little bit different question. Your radio equipment that you were using, was that in a bunker or a building or a trailer? What was it in?
Part of it, most of it was in a bunker, which we had 10 by 10 timbers over top of us with sandbags all the way around it. And then we had another communications trailer that was not bunkered very well with sandbags outside. And most of our communication stuff was on a couple scaffold towers. And we had the antennas up there. And about halfway up, a couple spotters would sit in there all day, too, to spot the rounds that were coming in. So they used it for that. And one of the times there was kind of funny that somebody had a bulldozer, I forget what they were doing, but they backed into one of the guy wires, holding up that scaffolding, and it just twisted right down to the ground. The two guys in it, they just rode it right to the ground. But unfortunately, all of our antennas came down with it. And it wasn't that hard to put it back up, which we did, and started hooking everything back up. And I went for a 36-hour stretch there with not a break, getting everything hooked back up, because these guys out in the field were just absolutely dependent on our communications. And we got it back up in 36 hours, and our commanding officer was bringing us our food, so we weren't going to take time in the mess hall. And we get the thing back up and operating, like I said, within 36 hours, and he gets the Bronze Star.
Oh, well.
Yeah, I figured out that's how the Army works, and
All right. Now, your story is featured in a book by a local author, Rick Weiss, who had
Yes.
met different veterans and so forth, and talked with them. And one of the things he noted in the book was that you took a lot of pictures in Vietnam.
yeah.
How did that come about?
Well, I bought one of these little small Instamatic cameras that came out. They were really, really neat, and I could carry it in the pocket. And if it was bad weather or whatever, I could even have it in a little plastic bag just to keep it dry.
Right.
But man, I was out snapping pictures all the time. I was having a good time doing that. And they were on a little plastic. There were like 20 pictures in a little plastic case, and then you would send them in to have them developed, and I'd have them sent back to my parents. And they'd send them back to me first, and then what I would do is I would look at them, and I would give a description as to what was going on each one of them. And I ended up doing that with about 600 slides. And unfortunately today, I don't know what happened to most of them. I still got about 150 of them that, tell a good story, but I'm just baffled as to where they went. But
Well, when you got back from Vietnam, did you just put all that stuff away?
Yeah, it all, like I said, it got packaged in a box, and that was it.
Okay. So when you're winding down, getting into the last days, how many days in advance did you know when you were leaving?
You left right on the day was already assigned.
Okay.
Now, I kind of cheated and wanted to get out of that base, so I kind of went there to the out processing thing 2 days ahead of time, hoping I could get out 2 days early, but they wouldn't let me. But we left out of that Tan Son Nhut Air Base in Saigon.
Yep.
And that was quite a trip when you got a plane load of guys and you clear the coastline of Vietnam. There was just cheering, and it wasn't high fives back in those days, but same kind of activity. These guys, we were all very happy that we were on the way home. We'd cleared the airspace.
All right.
But then when we got back to Oakland, nobody was ready for us. It was the Friday night of Labor Day weekend, and everybody had the weekend off. So we're sitting there, no food, no physicals, no nothing. And finally, one of the guys, I don't know if it was on Saturday or whatever, went and called his congressman. And all of a sudden on Sunday, boy, there were a few people starting to show up. And we started to get processed out Sunday afternoon. And I got on an airplane. They held the door for me at the San Francisco airport back, if you can imagine it, to make a flight to Chicago. So I never even had a chance to call my parents until I got to Chicago.
And then
I had to fly on to Grand Rapids.
Okay. All right. And in the meantime, so did they? But they did at least out process you. I mean, there was some kind of discharge process for you on
But
that
it was
Sunday.
very minimal. You know,
Okay.
I didn't get a physical. I didn't get a dental check. All this kind of. I didn't get my medals. None of that. It
Yep.
was just bare basics, just enough paperwork so that you could get out and get on an airplane.
Okay. And now, once you get back home again, now what do you do?
Well, the job that I had, I could go back to, but my parents had a bunch of people over on Labor Day at their house, and so all the relatives were there. And then come Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, I had to look to buy a car. And because I wanted to start work the following Monday, and went right back to my job that following Monday, and just put everything behind me and
Now, was
moved
that
on.
with the real estate job?
No, this was when I graduated from Ferris. Keeler Brass Company in Grand Rapids wanted me to work as a production controller because I'd worked in a lot of
Okay.
different departments there over the time that I was working there part-time, going to school. So became production controller for a few months, went to Vietnam, came right back to that job again, and stayed in that job for a couple months, and then I got transferred to customer service, and then I got moved to High Point, North Carolina as their salesman in High Point, North Carolina, because they made furniture, hardware.
Okay.
So,
I got on to a career from there.
yeah.
All right. Now, let's see. And somewhere along the line, you got married too?
Yes. That was after I got back from Vietnam. Every girl I'd ever known was married and had a couple kids already, so. But I met my wife, Mary, and she was 8 years younger than I was, but we got married, and we're going to celebrate 47 years here in another couple months.
All right. So how did you wind up back in Michigan?
That's what Keywood Brass moved me down. Keywood Brass Company got sold, and after they got sold, I wasn't real happy with the new people that bought the company. And in the meantime, one of my big customers for Keywood Brass that I worked with down there was the Lane Furniture Company, and they wanted me to be their rep back in Michigan. So they moved me back to Grand Rapids.
Very good.
With my 3 kids.
All right. And then did the Vietnam experience have any kind of lasting side effects, mental or physical?
Well, the physical is, when I was age 60, I came down with the prostate cancer from the Agent Orange, because that's how they cleared that whole base where I was. And I didn't really realize it at the time. All of a sudden, I'm in for a physical, and my doctor says, boy, all of a sudden your PSA number took a good jump. But it's not danger level, but he says, I think something's wrong. So they sent me to a urologist, had it checked. He says, yeah, your prostate's about 40% cancer. And I says, what do we do about it? He said, well, you can do seeds, but I won't guarantee that. He says, you can, you can just let it go and die. He says, or we can do robotic surgery, but that's not always a sure thing either. He says, or I can just cut you open and do it by hand, because he said, I think I can do the best job that way. So 8 days later, my prostate was gone. But unfortunately, after a few years, cancer was back again. So then I went in for 8 weeks of radiation every day for 8 weeks, and I got through that, looked good for a while. A couple years later, back again. And that's what they said about it is, it comes on early, at age 60. It comes on very aggressively, and it's very hard to knock it out. And so I'm still living with it today. Here, 15 years later.
Right. Okay. Now, does the VA recognize this as?
Oh yes.
Okay.
They did right away.
All right.
Right away. I didn't realize the VA was even in existence until this happened. And everybody kept telling me, well, you got to contact the VA.
Okay. And have you had any PTSD type issues?
Well, I got tested for it right afterwards. I was feeling a little depressed after the surgery because, hey, they take a very important part of you away.
Right.
And they tested me, and I should have taken along the list, but it was a whole bunch of things that I suffered from. But, I never thought they were bad, but my wife realized she didn't like some of them. But, so it helped us meet and figure out why I was doing the things I was doing. And when she could understand it, and it gave me a little better understanding of why I was doing these things, we ended up getting along a lot better.
Okay.
So,
now, were these, there's a lot of different kinds of ways in which the PTSD manifests itself. Sometimes people get angry, they get violent, or they just have peculiar behavior patterns. Can you give an example of what yours was like?
well, the one thing that bugged my wife, we'd go to a motel or a hotel or something like that, and I was always checking out how many steps it was from the door to the fire escape, and she couldn't understand that. But for me, I always had to know the escape routes. I always had to know directions. I was very nutty about directions, maps, which way was north. A lot of crazy things, and my ever vigilance was just driving her nuts because I was always trying to plan what we would do if this happened, and then what we would do if that happened, and have it all planned out that way. So.
Yeah, and you kind of lived with that all those years, and then you kind of figured it out.
And then all of a sudden, here it was in black and white in front of me, why I was doing what I was doing, and she could see why I was doing what I was doing. And what it did for our relationship was a lot better as a result.
Okay. Now, were there positive things that you took out of your service time?
It was the discipline part of it. We knew what I had to do, why I had to do it, and that people depended on me when I was in service. And in business, it was going to be the same way. You know, if the company I was working for wasn't making a profit, I wasn't going to advance. I wasn't going to be getting a better job.
All right.
So
So the whole thing makes for a pretty good story. So I'd just like to thank you for coming and sharing it today.
well, thank you for the opportunity.